I want to begin by acknowledging that there's much merit within this bill, and sort of a couple of really important points. I'd actually really would like to be supporting the bill. When I came into this chamber in February, I wanted to be somebody who would be constructive in my engagement, who would try to find merit, who would try to work collaboratively, who would see a bill and simply not try to oppose it just because it came from somebody who believed differently to what I did in the world. But there are parts, and there are significant parts of this bill that would make it enormously difficult for me to support. And I want to face those out with the Minister if possible, try to amend them, try to rectify them, and try to make it a bill that would be fair and equitable, that provides a sense of decency, that is just, that is equal in how it treats people. I remember in March when we introduced this pandemic unemployment payment. It was an extraordinarily appropriate measure from the government. It was something that was done promptly, and it gave a sense of safety to people. It acknowledged that the previous welfare rate of €203 was simply not enough to live on. Many of us have been advocating that for a long time, and recognised that in order to afford decency to people, in order that they may feed them families and not have to worry about the next bill coming through the door, €350 was an appropriate measure. I remember talking to the then Minister Regina Doherty about this measure, and even being sceptical and wondering would there be clawbacks coming, and we were assured that that wouldn't happen, that this €350 would be money that would be spent very quickly in the local economy. It would be spent in our butcher shops, it would be spent on our local high streets. It would help rejuvenate an economy that was asked to stop. And that's what the pandemic unemployment payment was supposed to do. It fostered a sense of cohesion. It gave us a sense of something, that we were all in this together and the state had our back. And then the dark clouds started to emerge. Then we started to fall back into old and worse habits. The first group to receive less than the pandemic unemployment payment were students who were told that they weren't working full-time in March, therefore you're not getting the full €350. And we didn't even take into consideration that that same cohort of people would have been working full-time now and using that money to spend throughout the economy over the next year or so. Then the temporary wage subsidy scheme, we found that wasn't going to apply to women returning from maternity leave, and that created another couple of weeks of furore, and that still hasn't been addressed yet. And now here we are. Here we are now, falling back into our old trope that people on welfare are somehow gaming the system. And often, sometimes I have to acknowledge the fact that this seems to happen at a time when the government is under pressure. We get this distraction about the fact that there are people in our airports who are taking their money and going overseas. That is not going to be allowed. We need to confront that and that mentality every step of the way. So I ask you, Minister, when did the COVID-19 pandemic end? Because you'd think such a victory would have merited more headlines, but it seems that I've missed it. What other explanation is there for the government's insistence that people on pandemic unemployment payment return to work? The whole sectors that shut down must have reopened after the Taoiseach's TV appearance at the weekend. Or did it happen, Minister, when yourself on July the 10th signed a statutory instrument meaning that travel advice issued by the Department of Foreign Affairs effectively had legal impact on just one small section of society who happened to be availing of social welfare supports? Or is there a far more sinister explanation? And the new government, not too dissimilar to the old government or the one that came before that, is using the bogey person of those on social welfare as a scapegoat. But for this government, it's not just as simple as telling people to get a job. The pandemic has made that a lot more difficult now, because we all know the reality. Aside from the fact that economic implications for small businesses of encouraging their staff to seek other jobs, ensuring that they incur costs and delays of recruitment when they attempt to reopen, it means that staff now would have to be issued with their P45s and redundancy payments. Except, as I understand it, workers on the pandemic unemployment payment cannot seek redundancy. So how can they seek employment if they are not technically unemployed? This is a huge gap in this bill that will need to be rectified before we can pass it. The new social welfare bill seeking changes the rules seeking work will have a massive implication for employers and employees, particularly around links between employers and employees and also access to redundancy. The government should not go ahead with these changes at all, because they destroy any sense of social cohesion that we so successfully fostered during the pandemic, and because the work isn't actually there. But certainly, it must not go through with these changes until statutory redundancy rights can be restored. This is not a small point. We're over 120 days now into, well, actually probably longer than that also, into the Debenhams workers who are still sitting outside the Debenham stores throughout the country because they've been prohibited from accessing redundancy. We need to make sure we change this, and we shan't let it pass without acknowledging that. Will the Minister provide the urgently required reassurance that employers will not be able to make employees redundant without employees being able to seek this redundancy? This abuse of workers, already ignored in the last couple of weeks by government, is not something that should be further sanctioned by changes in public policies just because the Taoiseach went on the TV over the weekend and had a rant. Your own backbench TDs have told you, and anyone who will listen on the airwaves over the last couple of days, what a terrible and unfair idea this is. I have a second question. Will the Minister assure us of the legality of the welfare and morality checks that are happening at the airports? Because I listened to the radio over the last couple of days, and the Irish Congress of Civil Liberty, who are far more of an authority on this than any Fine Gael minister or any Fine Gael parliamentarian who wishes to advocate this measure, have been very clear. The checks on passengers to establish if they were in receipt of the pandemic unemployment payment of €350 were discriminatory without any real justification being offered by the government for their use. I listened to my colleague Roisin Shortall asking the Taoiseach today as part of the parliamentary questions about what legal grounds this was brought in under, and the Taoiseach still couldn't really answer the question but mentioned the Social Welfare Bill of 2012. I think that's already been proven to be incorrect. So it was Sunday when this first came into the public consciousness. We've got any number of TV and radio appearances from government ministers and backbenchers. We've got a session all day in the Dáil today, and we still have no clarity of the legal grounds by which people are being discriminated against in our airports. Listening to Liam Harrick of the Irish Congress of Civil Liberties on the radio this morning raised some very serious concerns, because advice on travel is just that for one section of society, those who aren't on welfare. Yet it has the force of law for those who are on welfare. Are these welfare checks, Minister, or are they morality checks? My third question relates to how, as our Taoiseach put it, departments are getting information from airports. Minister, do you accept that this raises very serious concerns with regards to where the information came from and whether it was lawfully obtained and shared? These are really dangerous points here that require clarification, particularly around freedom of movement and discrimination. We absolutely have to ask how people are being targeted at our airports. Before we can pass this bill, we have to understand the ramifications of it for people. Is there racial or is there ethnic profiling ongoing? Are people from minority communities being targeted in our airports? There are also questions, Minister, I would like answered immediately with regards to where this advice to start targeting people at airports came from. Did it come from Cabinet? Was it brought to Cabinet? A senior minister today said on the radio that it wasn't. Is that correct? Did you seek advice on its legality from the Attorney General? Did you have any evidence of mass fraud or even of hundreds of people leaving the country while in receipt of the payment, given your continued insistence that we do not need a travel ban? Those questions are really important. I do also want to touch very briefly on another sector of our society who are being unfairly discriminated against with this measure, and that's our arts community. And it's very welcome that all other deputies have spoken so far, have raised the issue of our arts community. Minister, I recognise that you're a former Minister for Arts and Culture and brought through some very worthy measures in that regard. Can you not accept that our arts community are crying out for assistance at this time? We're going to need our arts community more than ever as our economy reopens up. We're going to need them to help us gather once again in friends and be comfortable in that situation. We're going to need them to help us laugh. We're going to need them to help us cry. We're going to need to help us understand the trauma of what was the last couple of months during this pandemic. And yet, we'll be expecting to meet that needs. You're going to ask them to once again live in poverty. And that's what we're going to ask them with this measure. Our arts community, who will not be able to avail of the €350, and we've all been contacted by hundreds of artists over the last couple of days, are going to live in poverty if this measure is passed tonight. We simply cannot. That's unacceptable. We ask so much of our arts community and have offered them very little in return. We went from having one of the lowest arts sector funding in the EU to now bringing in a measure that afforded them some sense of dignity during the pandemic, and now we're going to strip them away at the same time, asking them to keep creating on the world-renowned level that they've done to this point. Minister, that needs to change. We need to respect our artistic community. Can Carla, I've seek your advice. I have an amendment to this bill. I'm wondering, would now be the appropriate time to...
No, we'll be looking at amendments at the committee and final stages.
OK, I'll speak for it then.
Thank you.